Once again, my name is Maryela Perez, and I'm an undergraduate senior majoring in modern literature and minoring in Latin American and Latino studies here at Santa Cruz. And the title of my presentation is Post-1992 Los Angeles Literature, the Depiction of Internal Border Zones and Reimagined Space. My interest in this project came from having grown up in a low-income community and noticing how members of racially marginalized communities such as mine are oftentimes faced with physical and socially constructed barriers that are not visible to other classes. So having talked to my mentor, Christine Hong, about this and about my interest in spaces and boundaries, particularly those seen in low-income communities like the barrio, she prompted me to look at Chicano literature with a critical lens and see how physical and social boundaries within these communities, specifically the barrio, are addressed and treated amongst novels and texts. So arguing that post-1992 Chicano literature offers a contestatory imagining of the barrio, this project will look at two novels. It'll look at Always Running by Luis Rodriguez and Locas by Ixta Maya Murray, and analyze the creation and treatment of space and borders in these novels, and investigate what happens when borders within these spaces are crossed. In turn, this project will analyze how through the role of mobility, through the role of mobility within the protagonist's lives, the authors critique ethnic ghettoization and social constructs within a barrio that has been witness to constant class and racial discrimination. So with that in mind, my research questions for this project are, how does Chicano literature reimagine physical and social space within a barrio in the wake of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, and what exactly is the role of this reimagining? So I'm using the 1992 LA riots as a backdrop for this project, and before going into the significance of these riots for this particular project, I want to go over a brief history of what exactly these riots were. So with that said, on March 3rd, 1991, a man by the name of Rodney King was stopped by the LAPD after a highway pursuit around the San Fernando Valley. He was stopped by four members of the LAPD who, upon stopping him, went on to beat him 56 times, and they kicked him like 11 times, which resulted in him having 11 fractures to the head and to the brain, as well as damage to his kidney. So while the beating was happening, there was a man that was awoken like in a nearby building by all the commotion, because this was happening, but at the same time there was around 17 other members of the LAPD just watching it happen. So he was awoken and he saw it happening, and he took out his camera that he had just gotten, because it was like the 90s, so it was one of the big ones, and he recorded the event. And the very next day he went to an LA news station and he turned over the tape, and that very same day the tape was aired, and that evening it was aired nationally. And so there was video evidence of this happening, and then on April 29th, 1992, the four officers involved in the case were put to trial, but only one of them was actually found guilty for using excessive force. So this news came it was terrible news, and the community, particularly the one in South Central, mobilized and they rioted against it, and the riots lasted 3 days. And on the surface, it cost Los Angeles about $1 billion worth of infrastructure repair, but internally, this is something that served as the community's way of challenging class and racial injustices that had been seen in racially marginalized communities such as theirs. So I'm using this particular event as a backdrop for this project because they serve as the first post-civil rights riots that were raised into national view. They were a multi-ethnic riot, which Latinos and Chicanos were hugely represented in terms of the demographics of the city of Los Angeles. Unlike the Watts riots of the 1960s, which largely involved the African-American community, these riots mobilized through multi-ethnic neighborhoods such as the barrio. And they shone light on the fact that although people thought that post-civil rights meant that racism was over, it was kind of like, no, there's still a lot of work to be done. It was just kind of hiding. I mean, even if you consider the fact that this reached national view because someone happened to record it. So when you consider that, it kind of put into question, like, what other things were happening that we're not talking about? So with that said, the urban and Chicano literature that emerges from this particular period is one that is very, very aware of its surroundings and the treatment of space and the boundaries that are placed on members of these communities. And yeah, so as previously mentioned, the two novels that I worked with, I should say, are Always Running by Luis Rodriguez and Locas by Ixta Maya Murray. They were both published post-1992. Always Running was in 93 and Locas in 97. So Always Running was chosen for this particular project because it offers a good documentation of what it's like to be a young male living in a barrio in the San Gabriel Valley, which is east of Los Angeles. The main character, Chin, becomes involved in the gang life at the young age of 12, soon becoming a veteran of gang warfare. Throughout the novel, we see Chin lose friends to violence and drugs, but despite this, it's a coming of age story, and he's very aware of everything that's happening throughout the whole thing. And the fact that there are a lot of social expectations given to him as a young Latino male living in a low-income community. So he knows that he wants to move forward, and he's constantly challenging these boundaries and these borders that are placed upon him. And he eventually ends up being successful and leaves the gang life behind and gets an education. So we see these barriers being placed, but at the same time, he's challenging them and moving forward. The second novel I analyze is Locas by Ixta Maya Murray. Much like Always Running, the barrio is a setting for this novel as well. It's set in Echo Park. And it provides the reader with not one, but two female protagonists who, although both live in the same barrio, lead two very, very different paths. So the first of the protagonists is Lucia. As a character, she is very she is very strong and power hungry. She starts off the novel as being the girlfriend of one of the gangsters, and she quickly realizes that she wants to have some of the powers that she sees like males having. She proves to be an appropriate character for this particular project because she crosses and challenges a lot of these gender boundaries in the very patriarchal barrio setting. And she is in fact really successful in crossing these gender boundaries. Eventually, as I will talk about in a bit, she becomes a dominant player in the gang life within this community and then within this neighborhood. And the other protagonist that is presented within this novel is named Cecilia, and she is faced with the same exact gender boundaries that Lucia is, but she approaches them completely differently. Although she is aware that she has these boundaries set upon them, she does not challenge them for fear of losing the protection and security offered to her as a gangster's girlfriend. So with Locas, Maya gives us an insight into the inner workings and inner relations of the gang life in the barrio from the perspective of two very different women in a world that contains the exact same boundaries that we see in Always Running, but just with the female lens. So I know that I've referred to the idea of space and boundaries a few times now, so I want to kind of go over what I mean exactly by this. So my first definition of space is in terms of physical space. When I mean physical space, I mean anything from neighborhoods, rooms, houses, city markers such as bridges, railroad tracks, prisons. More specifically, when referring to the physical space, I'm referring to markers within the novels that physically dictate what is of bounds and what is out of bounds for these characters. And the second definition of space in this project is used when referring to space to the barrio as a social space. So this is basically referring to the interactions and inner workings of the community. Within this social space, I examine the interrelations of race and class, as well as the social constructs and expectations given to the protagonists as members of low-income communities. It is in examining these interrelations that we are able to see that a lot of these issues serve as psychological boundaries to the characters, kind of leaving it up to them to either continue to remain underrepresented and oppressed, or to challenge these socially constructed barriers and attempt to break free from the norm. So we see the critique of the physical space by the authors in both novels by the way in which they write about the physical areas that are surrounding these characters. So for example, in Always Running, Rodriguez writes, unincorporated county territory was generally for the poor, where the poorest people lived. The old barrios, which for the most part didn't belong to any city because nobody wanted them. Most of Watts and a large part of East Los Angeles was unincorporated territory. And then and similarly in Locas, we see Maya Murray write, see, if you live in Echo Park, you don't see California. You don't see sharp-dressed people who work in offices and shop in stores. Instead, all you see are the power lines and broken sidewalks, clica gangs scrawling up and down the walls, and cholos hanging on the corner with their hairnets and cigarettes. So the characters that, these two perspectives are told by the characters. So the characters are very, very aware of the fact that they live in undesirable areas, but that somehow they kind of have this notion that that's where they belong because that's what they've been told. So even then, even when these spaces are crossed, for example, like there's a scene in Always Running where Gene and his friends go to Huntington Beach to just have like a beach day, and they're like leaving, and then a group of surfers come up to them and they like harass them. They're like, "What are you guys doing here? You don't belong. Go back to the ghetto. Go back to where you don't, just get out of here," basically. And there are a lot of scenes like this throughout both of the novels where the characters are kind of, they don't even intentionally cross these borders, but they just happen to like move from one area to the other, and then they're automatically shut down. So taking all of this into consideration, I don't know what happened, but taking all of this into consideration, in both novels, we see the protagonists reimagine the barrio, which is a space that they do belong in, as a way to provide the community the ability to be an actual community. These neighborhoods are oftentimes marked as having dirty surroundings and representing any lack of true presence of authority or the city input. Even so, even so, it kind of encompasses this cultural domain where the characters have the ability to keep their culture, but at the same time, the other half of it being the assimilation to the American culture. So it's kind of like so the barrio kind of serves as a mirror to the characters, in the sense that the barrio in itself is trying to, it's in America, it's like it's not in Mexico, it's not in El Salvador, it's not in other spaces, but at the same time, it's trying to maintain the culture, but it's assimilating into American culture. So I think this is out of order, but oh no, okay. So when describing the houses in his neighborhoods, Chin, for example, he states, "The order of these houses was different, full of fragrances, sweet and nauseating. On 105th Street, the smells were of fried lard, of beans, car fumes, of factory smoke, of homemade brew out of backyard stills. There were chicken smells and goat smells and grassless yards filled with engine parts and wire and wood planks, cranked and sprinkled with rusty nails. These were the familiar aromas, the funky earth and mechanical smells which were absent from the homes my mother cleaned." So Rodriguez, in this particular quote, does a great job at describing the cultural duality that I just kind of tried to explain, that is seen in the barrio, which becomes a space where the home culture and assimilation to American culture kind of meets.